Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today, continuing on with the reviewing the books from the Booker long list, I am going to be talking about Glory by NoViolet Bulawayo. She is not a stranger to the shortlist, having been shortlisted in 2013, I believe it was. And so really interesting to see her again on the long list. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this book. I will say right from the off that I will talk about some spoilers later. They're probably going to be quite mild spoilers anyway, but obviously feel free to click off at that point. But the majority of this review should be pretty much spoiler free. But essentially, let's get stuck into talking about this book. And sort of long story short, I greatly enjoyed it. I think I did sort of struggle with bits of it. But overall, I think this is a really confident and poised book, and I'm really excited to talk a bit more about it. So let's get on with it. So Glory itself, it has been, well, I mean, a lot has been spoken about with this book. The fact that it uses the sort of ideas of things like Animal Farm, in terms of it uses that as a bit of a sort of template almost to explore this idea of political strife, particularly in Zimbabwe, and particularly looking at Robert Mugabe. And it does this by kind of creating, by making the townspeople of the town all into animals. And it's sort of fairly sort of generic how the animals are sort of distributed in some ways, apart from some where there are specific characters sort of done, and we have sort of reference to the old horse from Mugabe, and we have sort of other characters who are sort of done in sort of other animal ways. Everyone else is fairly diverse. It's sort of just an array of animals all sort of living their life, and then you get these weird visuals as well, because for example you have animals tweeting, or you have animals sort of writing things down, and you've kind of got this image of like a little like sheep hoof trying to like type with a phone, which is great. And this is a book that just really explores a lot of local politics, and particularly plays around with a lot of ideas about how people come to accept political change, or even how they come to accept bad political leaders, to put it lightly, how they come to accept things because they're sort of swayed by a certain argument, or because something appeals to something emotional in them, and in some ways appeals to something animal in them. And I think that's sort of part of the point that's happening here. I mean, I should state from the beginning, I've seen some really interesting sort of discourse, I guess, about this, where people have said, actually, Glory is not the African Animal Farm. Like, it is a book by an African that uses Animal Farm as a sort of template. And I think we probably should avoid sort of kind of giving it that kind of those sort of terms to almost make it sound like, this is the sole answer or whatever over here. I think this book is sort of just playing and borrowing on themes that other literature does as well, and it sort of shouldn't be sort of marked out as being different in that sense because of that. And I think this is just a really interesting book in terms of how it explores that. And in terms of how it plays around with local ideas and myths and tales, and weaves it into this sort of story that is largely just about political strife. I mean, in some ways, that's something that I think feels so exciting about this book in many parts, is that something is happening over here that's kind of grim and horrific, but the book is sort of quite sing-songy and playful and almost silly at times in a really enjoyable way. But in a way that is actually a really clever commentary, I think, about how actually people mostly just go on and live their lives. They tell tales, they sing songs, they do things, all while this sort of political strife is going on, and they are not the government, right? They live very different lives, and that becomes very, very clear in this book. And I think I've sort of mentioned the sort of sing-song playfulness about it, and there are often phrases where the book sort of just loops around in this sort of thing of they did this and then they're this and then they're this, and sort of does this weird sort of does this sort of repetition that is really sing-songy. It feels like somebody is singing a nursery rhyme, or is sort of playing around and sort of having fun with language. And I think that's something that feels really distinctive and really interesting about this book. An example being, we have the name of the town is Jadada or Jadada. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. And every time it's mentioned, it's Jadada with a da and another da, and it's always delivered as that phrase. And there's something kind of really interesting about that, I think, of sort of it turns it into a slogan almost, which fits the sort of political narrative going on, that we're not only talking about Jadada as a nation or Judea. I'm gonna, apologies in advance if I'm saying this incorrectly. I have no cues to go on with this. I probably should have just listened to the audiobook. But let's go with Jadada. And that kind of sing-songy slogan is then also sort of weaponized by various people around them to kind of say, like, look, we're this people, I know this slogan, I'm one of you, even when that isn't necessarily the truth. We also have sections where it plays around and we have these sort of fake tweets that appear in the book. And these tweets are sort of meant to, I suppose, show this sort of discourse between characters of sort of, a political moment happens and you've got one person saying, down with the government. And you've got other people kind of being like, well, I quite liked this, and I thought this other thing was kind of work. Or, these weird arguments happening where somebody says down with the government and someone's like, well, you didn't say this about the last government. And, these sort of snarky asides that feels very true to internet discourse. So, I feel like NoViolet Bulawayo has spent some time on Twitter to kind of get the vibe of this. And I thought that was really successful and really quite clever in it. I think what this book does really well is sort of show how politics can work in an age of misinformation and disinformation. And I think also how we shouldn't always be necessarily looking to government to be the one and only solution. Because at one point in this book, without giving spoilers, there are it seems like we're going to have this change of power and everybody's really excited about a new change. And then nothing really changes. And there's something in that this book really deals with and grapples with, which I think is really engaging and entertaining. And I think quite powerfully gets to the heart of that kind of key kind of topic within the book. I will say that at times that it didn't always work for me, not necessarily the political aspect. I think this book is really good at the political bit. I think it's really good at kind of creating this world of this sort of village, this town who have this sort of broad range of views and sort of watching the sort of political turmoil. I will say at times I sort of needed it maybe to get there a bit quicker. I mean, it's 400 pages and I realize that sounds really impatient of me to kind of be like, just do this quicker. And I wouldn't want to cut the sing-songy bit. That's the thing. I think that was actually really successful, the sort of building this rhythm of this book. I also think because I read this as my 12th book of the book-along list, I was probably also just having a bit of booker fatigue. So take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt, because it's probably that more than anything else. But I do think sort of at times it did feel like it was sort of looping round. Again, that is probably the point being made by this book, that actually these political things, we think it's going to be a quick change and everything's good and new and exciting, and we end back where we were before. These things just go in cycles and it seems to never change. Another thing I will sort of say is I see why animals were used. There's a sort of trope kind of within the book, or the kind of theme within the book, to kind of show the sort of people being swayed by sort of political arguments. I also don't know if it needed it. I don't know if there was something unique about that animal approach that actually added something to the book necessarily. I'm willing to be challenged on that. If I see a really compelling argument for why that is, I'm perfectly willing to kind of engage with that. I think there were just sort of times in this book where I was sort of wondering, if this hadn't been animals, this still would have, I don't think this story would have been particularly different. So I'm not entirely sure why we have animals here, but regardless, I think this is a really fun, really engaging book. I think it's a very clever book. I think it, deserves to be on the shortlist. Whether it will be or not, we shall see. I mean, it will be the day this video goes out, the shortlist will be announced. So let's see. But I'm really excited just to kind of see a bit more about how people got on with this book. There were times where I didn't fully get on board with this. This was a 4 instead of a 5-star for me. However, I think there's a lot to champion about this book. I think it's a really clever and insightful book. I think, NoViolet Bulawayo has done a really clever thing in taking what could feel like a really intense and loaded discussion about Mugabe, about many other parts of sort of politics, and she has boiled it down really cleverly, I think, into a really enjoyable tale that has quite a lot to say at its heart, in much the same way that Animal Farm did, of kind of taking quite a serious political discussion and finding the kind of almost gallows humour in it all, and the sort of absurdity of being able to laugh at something that's terrifying. So yeah, really keen to hear more people's thoughts on this. And I'm going to go into some light spoilers now as well. This is not a major spoiler, but I think it's sort of worth saying, and I kind of hinted towards it earlier, but this book does quite a lot in terms of the cycles of government. And so we do see this sort of idea of sort of Mugabe being deposed, or a leader being deposed, and he is followed by somebody who, or at least there's a sort of a candidate who we're meant to see as being this new breath of fresh air, and within a short period of time we realise that there's corruption going on, or we realise that other things are still happening. So actually the government can change, or the leader can change, and maybe necessarily that doesn't solve the problems in the country. And I think this book explores that really interestingly, with sort of having this sort of wave of new election sloganeering and campaigning, all of which leads to some of the same outcomes. And so we have this set of characters in this village or this town who are just tired of basically being lied to and then ending up with the same thing again and again. And I think that plays in quite interestingly towards the end, where we start getting quite a few brutal moments happening that sort of permeate the kind of silliness and sort of humour of the book, that actually we go from sort of being able to laugh along a little bit whilst acknowledging that it's terrifying, to actually seeing the real ramifications of that terror in a couple of incidents. So I think this book is really clever for how it does that. And I think, you know, I sort of will freely admit, you know, I don't know a great deal about politics in that region, or, you know, of Zimbabwe. I don't know a great deal about Mugabe, apart from the fact he was just there for a very long time, you know. And so I think this book does quite a lot to dig into some of those discussions, and to sort of, you know, essentially suggest, yeah, Mugabe can go, but the void that is then left, do we really think there's going to be a leader straight away who's going to be this sort of perfect man of the people or person of the people who can do whatever and, you know, is going to change this country? Maybe not. Maybe it's going to take a while, because we've got a structure that's wrong, as well as perhaps a leader like Mugabe. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker talking about this book. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I would be really keen to hear some of your thoughts about this book, particularly sort of the kind of animal aspect. I'm still sort of a little bit torn on whether it was necessary, but I actually, regardless, I enjoyed the book. I thought it was interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I've been Bob the Booker. Take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.